First of all, I'd just like to say thank you for inviting us here today to talk to you about the Innocence Network and the Innocence projects. It's a shame that the projector's not working because I do have lots and lots of pretty pictures and quotations, but I'll just have to do it myself from the lectern. What I'm going to do is just kind of talk you through why we've actually set up Innocence projects in the United Kingdom. You may have heard that these things stem from the United States. They've had Innocence projects in the United States now for almost 20 years, where students work on cases of prisoners who maintain their innocence. And they've had some great successes. However you want to measure that. You might want to measure successes in terms of cases overturned. And in America, in the last 20 years, they've overturned almost 500 cases. Many of the people in the cases they've overturned were people who were on death row, or they were either given a life sentence without parole. Other ways of measuring success might be in terms of the educational experiences that people have had and the ethical kind of values that people have learnt while working on those cases. But what I want to do is just take you through the context of why we've set them up. So I want to say something first of all about the inherent fallibility of the criminal justice system and the way in which innocent people can be wrongly convicted. I want to say something about the limitations of our criminal appeal system and the Criminal Cases Review Commission, to show that often innocent people are unable to overturn their wrongful convictions. They can exhaust legal aid, they can exhaust the criminal appeal system and remain in prison with no assistance whatsoever. I want to say a little bit about the experience of prisoners who maintain their innocence in prison and the inability of the parole system and the prison system to actually, deal with prisoners who maintain their innocence, deal with claims of innocence. And then I'll say a little bit more about why we set up the Innocence Network UK, progress to date, and why I think we need to be a network as opposed to individual innocence projects just working independently of one another. First and foremost, I think the context that we need to think about is this is from a judgment which was in the House of Lords. It's in a case called Director of Public Prosecutions versus Shannon, and this is the quotation from that judgment. And it says, "The law in action is not concerned with absolute truth, but with proof before a fallible human tribunal to a requisite standard of probability in accordance with formal rules of evidence." And I think that really, really neatly tells us what our actual criminal justice process is actually about. It's not objective, it's not about a pursuit of truth, it's a fallible human system, it's a fallible human process. And in that fallible human process, some of the key fallibility, key flaws of our criminal justice system, you can actually get sight of them if you do an analysis of successful appeals against criminal convictions. When I often talk about these things, my students sometimes think that I'm somehow kind of overcritical of our system. But these are successful appeals against criminal conviction. It's not things that I'm actually speculating or making up. And some of the key flaws are unreliable confession evidence. And one of the cases, the key cases for that, is the Cardiff News Agent 3, where 3 men, obviously from Cardiff, spent 30 years in prison for killing a newsagent that they didn't kill following a false confession by one of the co-accused. If you look at the work of Gisliger Johnson, you see there's a whole range of reasons why people give false confessions against themselves. It's not always because the police are torturing them or intimidating them. It's sometimes that people have got compliant personalities. People might be vulnerable suspects who can't actually take a lot of pressure or questioning from the police, even if the police aren't meaning to put pressure on them. And some people even walk into police stations and volunteer that they've committed serious crimes and murders when they didn't. Another key problem that we have with our system, and this is a feature of most of the cases that are being worked on by the Innocence projects at the moment, is something called prison grass evidence. A key authority for that is Reg Dudley and Bob Maynard, who each spent 20 years in prison following a deal that was made between the police and another guy who was in prison, who was given a deal and charges against him were dropped for giving false evidence against Dudley and Maynard. They spent 40 years in prison. What's interesting about that case is Tony Wilde, the guy who actually did the deal with the prison officers and the police to give this false testimony, we only know about this because he stepped forward when he became a born-again Christian and said he couldn't live with his conscience about what he'd actually done to Dudley and Maynard. What's interesting was he wasn't that much of a believer in God, because he actually wanted anonymity and protection before he admitted that he'd actually given this false testimony. Non-disclosure by the prosecution. You know, we have an adversarial system, we all know about that, and again it's a battle. It's about trying to win your cases, and in that battle often prosecutors are not inclined to actually pass on evidence which actually gives weight to the defence case. And John Kamara, he's a key authority on this problem. He spent 20 years in prison, and he overturned his conviction when it was found that the Crown Prosecution Service had failed to actually disclose 200 witness statements, which actually proved that he actually couldn't have had any part in the crime. Malicious allegations. People actually tell lies about each other. And it's a big problem as well. We've got, I think, something like 40% of the applicants to the Innocence Network UK are claiming to be victims of false allegations of sexual or physical abuse. One of the key authorities is Warren Blackwell. He spent 3 years in prison for sexually assaulting a woman who had a history of making false claims. This case made British legal history when she was named in the House of Lords, because what she'd done is she had a history of actually making allegations against every male that she ever came across. She accused her first boyfriend of sexually abusing her. When she was examined, she was a virgin. She accused her father of sexually abusing her and her 2 brothers, and numerous other men were convicted following her testimony of false allegations. The reason why it was difficult to actually unearth all of this is every time she did it, she changed her name by deed poll. So it was very, very difficult to actually know what she was doing. Poor defence. There is an inequality of arms in the criminal justice process, and often defence lawyers don't actually act as properly as they might. And a recent case is Andrew Adams, who spent 15 years in prison following what the CCRC found to be, the Criminal Case Review Commission found to be, inadequate defence representation. Another problem, and it's an increasing problem, and it's tied to the kind of belief in the infallibility, in a fallible world, of forensic science expert testimony. And key cases here are women who've been convicted for murdering their children and given life sentences when their children died in unexplained circumstances. I kind of thought about it in these terms. This actually represents a new phenomena in miscarriage of justice, because if people like Sally Clark and Angela Cannings didn't kill their children, because we don't know, if they didn't, it means that they were convicted for murder and given a life sentence, as I said, when no crime actually occurred. Now, I could actually do a whole lecture about the way in which we rush now to criminalise, and imprisonment and criminalisation have become a first port of call as opposed to a last resort. But I think that that's an interesting one, because forensic science is starting to feature in more and more criminal trials, and once the forensic science is offered to the jury, it seems to trump all other evidence. At the Innocence Project, we've got very strong evidence sometimes that people haven't committed crimes, but there may have been some forensic science offered at trial which the jury thought was overwhelming and overpowering. Recently, you may have been aware of the Omar bombing trial, where a guy called Sean Hohe overturned his conviction because the conviction was obtained on low copy number DNA. And it's fascinating, his low copy number DNA, because what I could do is I could shake your hand and I could go downstairs now and I could have a cup of coffee, and I may not leave any of my DNA downstairs, I may leave your DNA downstairs, and you've never even been there. But yet, if there was a crime downstairs, you may actually be implicated in that crime, and you could get caught up in something that you were never even present at. In terms of the scale of successful appeals there are in our country, I mean, if you ask people, you know, how many miscarriages of justice do you think there are, people tend to think that they are quite rare and exceptional occurrences. People tend to trot out the same old cases. So people talk about the Birmingham 6, or the Guildford 4, or the Tottenham 3, or Judith Ward. They give you these names, Stephen Kisco, but they can tell you that the miscarriage of justice case is on 1 or 2 hands. And that's quite knowledgeable and well-informed people. The problem with that is that it gives the impression that miscarriage of justice are rare. Because if we're going to talk about the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4, these are people who were convicted in the 1970s for terrorist bombings. And if we're still talking about those cases today, I mean, it was before most of you were born. Well, probably before your parents were born. And it gives that impression that they're rare. But actually, if we define a miscarriage of justice in terms of a successful appeal against a criminal conviction, well, there are actually almost 5,000 successful appeals each year in this country. There's almost 20 a day. So every single day of every single week, there are 20 people who are overturning a criminal conviction, either in a Crown Court from a conviction in a Magistrates Court, or in the Court of Appeal through their first appeal, or through a CCRC referral. But we tend to only focus on the CCRC referrals. We don't see the routine and the mundane successful appeals as a problem. But I think that if you look in detail at the harmful consequences to the people of justice in error, exemplified in successful appeals, there's a lot of harm going on that we actually need to catch sight of. Now the thing is, when we're thinking about the question of innocence, a successful appeal against a criminal conviction is not evidence of innocence. Yeah? But what this does is, it shows us what the key flaws in our system are that the innocent can fall prey to. So then we're looking at the appeal system to see, how does the appeal system actually help the innocent who are caught up in this? Because our system actually doesn't care if you're innocent or guilty. It's about process. I mean, it doesn't really take a view on guilt or innocence. A criminal trial is about guilt or not guilt, to the specific charge that you've been charged with regard to the forms of evidence that are available. Criminal appeals are not about innocence either. They are also highly technical things. And it's about whether or not your conviction is unsafe in law. So if you can bring fresh evidence that the jury didn't hear, that might be that's the best way to try and overturn your conviction. But if you've got evidence of your factual innocence that was available at your original trial, or your solicitor could have actually gone out and found, that does not constitute grounds for appeal. So innocent people have to remain in prison. I mean, the reason why we're trying to resurrect this concern with the innocent is because we know the public, as far as they're concerned about miscarriage of justice, they're bothered about innocent people being in prison, but they're also bothered about guilty people getting away with it. And we're trying to introduce those ideas back into the system. Off the back of the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6 cases, there was something called the Royal Commission on Criminal Justice. And it was announced the day the Birmingham 6 overturned their convictions because of the public crisis of confidence that there was in the post-appeal referral powers of the Home Secretary at that time. So we ended up with this thing called the Criminal Cases Review Commission. And it was established not because the public crisis thought that the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4 should have their convictions overturned on technicalities. The public believed that these were innocent victims of wrongful conviction and imprisonment. But the problem is that if you looked at the detail of the statute which set up the CCRC, it says that the CCRC cannot refer cases back to the Court of Appeal if they find innocence. They can only refer cases back to the Court of Appeal if it's believed there's a real possibility that the case will be overturned. Well, that's interesting, because in order to apply to the CCRC, you've already got to have applied to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal is supposed to have said no. So it's not surprising that the CCRC don't refer many cases, because they're not only looking in terms of a real possibility in the future of the Court of Appeal overturning your case, it's looking back at what the Court of Appeal have actually just said about your case. So again, the CCRC does not resolve the problem of the wrongful conviction of the innocent. And it's become clear very, very recently. We had a conference with some commissioners from the Criminal Case Review Commission, and present at that conference was Paddy Joe Hill, one of the Birmingham 6 victims, and some of his organisation, the Miscarriage of Justice organisation. And in response to a direct question from Paddy Hill from the Birmingham 6 to a commissioner from the CCRC about his case, the commissioner said, if the Birmingham 6 case came to the CCRC today, if the Guildford 4 case came to the CCRC today, these cases wouldn't be referred. by the CCRC back to the Court of Appeal. So the body that was set up because of these cases wouldn't even refer those cases today. Prisoners maintaining innocence. I was going to show you some slides of a couple of men, Paul Blackburn and Robert Brown. Each of these men spent 25 years in prison maintaining innocence until they were able to overturn their convictions on appeal. If they'd have admitted their guilt in prison, they might have served about 12 years or 15 years. Prisoners maintaining innocence are required to comply with their sentence plans. They're required to undertake offending behaviour programmes which actually show that they are reducing their risk of reoffending. But they refuse to do that because they say that that would be tantamount to admitting to something that they haven't done. We've done some research with the Innocence Network UK which has shown that it's not just as simple as that. There are also their criminal appeal lawyers are saying to them, don't do these offending behaviour courses, don't comply with your sentence plan, because if you do, you may never overturn your conviction on appeal, because the appeal courts may actually see you doing those courses as admission of guilt. And it's interesting that of the 500 people who've written to the Innocence Network UK so far, asking for assistance, some of those people have spent 40 years in prison maintaining innocence, and if they'd admitted their guilt, they would have got out after about 10 years in prison. The system can't deal with the question of innocence. And what you find is that the operational remit of prisons, prison probation staff and the parole board is all to work from the basis that prisoners are guilty. There can be no room for the possibility that the courts get it wrong. We've just simply argued that that's untenable, that there has to be some allowance for the possibility that somebody in prison may actually be innocent. We're not saying anybody is, we're just saying somebody may be, and even that seems to be, well, up until recently it was a step too far. But I think that, you know, we are making some inroads, and I'll say something in a minute about a new policy initiative that we've been able to influence. This, at the moment, I'm just giving kind of context to why we set up the Innocence Network UK. As far as victim support organisations exist, you know, you might think, especially at a conference like this, that, you know, there are lots of other organisations that might actually deal with our issue, with the wrongful conviction and imprisonment of the innocent. But there aren't. Prior to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the organisation Justice and the organisation Liberty used to assist people who were claiming to be factually innocent and wrongly imprisoned. But what happened was that it was these organisations, and principally the organisation Justice, that actually campaigned, on Justice's part, for 40 years to get the state to actually set up something that could actually try to deal with the problem of the wrongful conviction of the innocent and assist potentially innocent victims of wrongful imprisonment. And in fact, it was the organisation Justice that provided the blueprint for what became the CCRC. So when the CCRC was announced, there was this idea that this problem was once and for all resolved now, that this body could actually send these cases back to the Court of Appeal. So in the mid-1990s, which is, you know, well over 10 years ago now, Justice stopped assisting people who were claiming to be factually innocent in prison. So did Liberty. And there was nothing at all. What happened was some kind of grassroots groups kind of formed to try to assist their kind of family members, their fathers, their brothers, their cousins. But because of the limitations of the CCRC, the notion of innocence was lost. And they started to try to help people find technical grounds to overturn their convictions, as opposed to asserting this kind of the need for a focus on innocence. And that's where we kind of came in. That's where we came in to kind of resurrect the kind of issue of innocence. If you've been on the Innocence Network UK website, we've left some leaflets and brochures here for you today. You'll see that we actually we've got three main aims. The first aim is about education, and that's where the Innocence projects come in. So our first aim is to encourage and support the creation of and subsequent running of member innocence projects in this country. The second aim is to do research, and so there's a whole range of research activities that we do, And the third one, as I said, is to try to communicate the findings of our research and the practical work by students in trying to overturn cases, to try to effect, to inform public debates and try to effect policy reforms. In terms of the education one, what we're primarily trying to do to start with is just to kind of induce a healthy scepticism into you, that the system actually can get it wrong and that innocent people can and perhaps are in prison. It is the usual pro bono kind of ethos of learning by doing. And it's about putting people over process. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's about a different form of ethics in criminal law. We got a letter, I got a phone call from the sister of one of our applicants last week. And she said that her brother had received a letter from his solicitor which had said to him that I have every reason to believe that you are factually innocent. However, the evidence of your innocence was available at your original trial. Therefore, it doesn't constitute grounds for appeal. I have actually informed the Legal Services Commission of this fact, and they have withdrawn your legal aid certificate. Therefore, I am withdrawing from your case, but best of luck with everything. Now, that's what lawyers, and I'm conscious where I am today because you want to be lawyers, you're going to be lawyers, but that's what lawyers call ethical behaviour. Because he is communicating to his client properly, he's telling his client what his situation is, but I can't imagine how that can be said to be ethical from a lay perspective. It's not what the person in the street would think is an ethical thing to do if he truly believed that that man is innocent. There must be something else he might be able to try to do. In terms of research, just briefly, we have these research symposiums. We've only been going for 4 years. We've had two of these already. And we're writing a book, 15 chapters, different contributors. That's coming out at next year. And there's some publications on our website if you want to look at that. And that'll tell you kind of some of the research findings from the Innocence Network UK research team. I think one of the most important pieces of research we've done so far is to try to clarify the different reasons for claims of innocence. I said earlier about the difficulties of prisoners maintaining innocence. All prisoners who maintain innocence are said to be in denial. There's no acceptance at all, as I said, about innocence. But what we've tried to do, we've been asked by our member projects to refer cases to them. So we don't want to send cases to our member projects of people who may be guilty. So on our questionnaire, we ask them to give us as much information as they can about their claim of innocence. And it's become, from analysis of those questionnaires, we've come up with a whole range of reasons why people say they're innocent when they're not. And it's not simply because they're in denial about their crimes. It's not simply that what they've done is so heinous that they can't accept what they've done. Sometimes they just don't understand the law. They don't understand joint enterprise. They think that because they didn't actually stab the security guard, that they're innocent. That they might be guilty of, for example, attempted robbery, but they're innocent of murder. So a lot of what we do at the Innocence Network UK is communicate to some of the people who apply to us to actually inform them and explain to them their legal culpability. And we've made a distinction between factual innocence and legal guilt. And we're trying to make that clear. We get people who write to us and say, I'm innocent. I've been wrongly convicted for having consensual sex with a 14-year-old girl. In my country, the age of consent is 12. Your system is wrong. So we write back and we say things like, if we were in Germany, we could drive our Singer Gazelle at 120 miles an hour on the Autobahn, but we can't do it over here. And they write back to us and they thank us for helping them to understand their legal culpability. And I think that we are truly helping them to be able to lead crime-free lives after, actually, because they truly do understand why they're in prison. In terms of these kind of key communications, I suppose, one of the things I say first of all, in terms of research, teaching and communication, we see a kind of synergy in what we do. And everything seems to be connected. So we started off with the teaching, with the Innocence projects and the practical work that they do. But what's happening is, as the students are actually working on the cases, they're actually coming up with obstacles and barriers to their casework. And they feed that back into the research agenda. So the research is actually real research. It's not blue skies research, not just something that we make up. We do research on what the practical difficulties that the students are coming up against. From that research we feed it back into the teaching in terms of how we train the students. So there's that kind of relationship there, but we're also kind of communicating our research findings to the Home Office and to the Ministry of Justice and the Prison Service, and we're getting better and better relationships with them. But we actually learn a lot when we actually talk to them, and that feeds back into our research agenda as well. So we see a direct link, therefore, between communication and teaching too. The whole rationale for what we're doing is to create a machine for unearthing the problems of the criminal justice system in need of fixing. Some of the research that we've done has seen, what we've shown is that, you may have a kind of speculation or an idea about what's wrong with our criminal justice system. You may say that it's racist, you may say that it's sexist, you may say that it discriminates against this group or that group. But unless you've actually got evidence to actually support that, nothing's actually going to change. And if you look at the history of the criminal justice system in England and Wales, for example, the key changes that we've always got them in response to high-profile cases which have exemplified that error. Now, this works on both sides of the coin. So, for example, we get the Court of Appeal Criminal Division off the back of a case called Adolf Beck that exemplified the need for a Court of Appeal. We abolished capital punishment off the back of Timothy Evans, which exemplified the possibility of actually executing the innocent. What's interesting there is we had a 250-year kind of campaign in England and Wales to abolish capital punishment in Britain. People were arguing on humanitarian grounds, it can't be right. There was posthumous pardons throughout the 19th century, which was evidence that the Home Office knew that they were actually executing innocent people. That didn't overturn it. What you needed was a case which exemplified this problem in such a way that it could induce a public crisis of confidence, get a governmental inquiry, and the recommendations of which overturned these things. It's how we got the CCRC, it's how we got the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. On the other side of the coin, the Stephen Lawrence affair led to the abolition of double jeopardy. So there's always cases at the heart of law reform. And that's what we're trying to do. We want the students to actually find new problems through their cases, feed them back in and make the system better. That's what it's all about. I said something about policy. Already we're starting to make some inroads in that. There is through our engagements with the Parole Board and the Ministry of Justice, a new training programme for prison and probation staff who deal with what's called indeterminate sentence prisoners, people who are put into prison and may never get out unless they satisfy the Parole Board that they've reduced their risk of reoffending. They're now being trained on Innocence Network UK methodology. Previously what's happened is a prisoner has come into prison and said, I'm innocent, and the prison officer, probation, parole has said, we're going to work on the basis that you are guilty. So that just leads to an impasse. But what we've been able to clarify is that the currency that the prisoner is using is a currency of factual innocence and factual guilt. The currency that the prison service is using and the parole board is legal innocence and legal guilt. And so what's happening now is, through our methodology and our typology of claims of innocence, that's been embraced, and 30,000 prison and probation staff who deal with prisoners, indeterminate sentence prisoners, lifers, are now being instructed to engage with prisoners who say they're innocent, to say, we are not saying that you are not factually innocent, what we are saying is that you are legally guilty, because you've just been convicted by a court, which is reasonable. But you may overturn your conviction on appeal. They're applying the typology of claims of innocence. They're trying to inform people about their legal culpability where that's appropriate, which probably in most cases. And the people who they can't do that with, they're going to give them legal information and give them information about the CCRC. We don't think they've gone far enough, but we think it's a massive step forward, because for the first time ever in our legal system, there's an official acknowledgement now that some people in prison may be innocent.